Bosozoku scooters. The weird little subculture of stylish 50cc bikes is an ever-going trend as a cheaper and a lot of the times more fun entryway into Japanese vehicle modifying. But what are these bikes? What's it all about? And how would I get into it? Well, it's only been a few seconds into this video and I've already lied to you. This isn't a Bosozoku scooter. Like is seen with a lot of 80s period correct styling of Japanese cars, people just generalize them under the umbrella term of Bosozoku, as they're easily the most well known in the genre, which I don't have the time to get into, but the scene in the West usually goes by Kyu-Gentsuki, loosely translating to old moped. Simply put, this is all about taking your 50cc Japanese scooter and making them visually striking, low, big arrow, crazy paint, and very loud. For brevity's sake, I will try to keep the history relatively short, but I would be really doing it a disservice without at least giving a summarized version. During the later 80s to mid 90s, magazines such as Young's Auto, Rider Comic, and Champ Road produced magazines which typically documented what I would generalize as the Yankee counterculture automotive scene, which mostly focused on bikes and cars. Although they differed in which material they focused on, typically they would include anything from clothing, cars, groups, even haircuts, but most importantly, scooters, all under this odd cross-section between an anti-establishment movement and with a touch of 60s-esque fictionalized Americana, so to speak, that was loved by those involved but hated by the general Japanese population. These magazines helped spread the culture of the Kyu-Gentsuki style. Due to the relatively cheap barrier of entry and the relatively small form factor, they were pretty easy for the average young Japanese person to purchase and customize, which caused it to grow and eventually peak in the mid-90s. Although almost 30 years removed, most of the tropes and trends would stay largely unchanged as the style progressed, but failed to make waves abroad. The newfound popularity for these bikes wouldn't come until the mid-2010s. I, like many other people, discovered the new wave of scooters amongst the North American Kaido racer scene in early 2019, as the relatively small niche began to reach the wider parts of Instagram. Although I was by no means an early adopter, this is around the time where I picked up my first bike, a Yamaha Raz. The scene saw its initial resurgence in the mid-2010s through people such as Brian BKR and Anders Bergvall, I think I'm pronouncing that right, began buying and importing parts to build their own Honda Arrows. And as more people discovered them, the more they grew in popularity. But how would I potentially get into this? Well, first you need a bike. Although the scene leans pretty heavily into personalization and leaving the styling up to you, it's by no means a free-for-all. There are a pretty stringent list of bikes that can be successfully brought into the style, typically referred to in the community as a base. Sorry bucko, but unfortunately no one will be offering undercals for the Hyosung Rally or your SYM anytime soon. The bikes originally delivered to North America that can really be used are the Aero 50, all three generations of Jog, Do2, Elite R, and the Yamaha Raz. All scooters will require some sort of conversion from the NA spec. You will at bare minimum need a non-DOT rear taillight assembly, and some require just a few optional parts to convert. Bikes such as the Do2 only really need a modification to their stock rear taillight, as they basically have a JDM tail underneath the mess of indicators and brake lights, where the Tact, on the other hand, easily the most popular bike, does require quite a bit of conversion. What we received in North America was basically a full mark Tact in Japan, which is wider with a little bit more storage capacity, partially to accept the fat American abroad. Although Aero is produced for the full mark plastics, most people opt to convert to the typical Tact spec to really complete the look. Each scooter will really require its own bit of modification, and it really depends on what you like. Aero typically consists of three major parts: the headset cowl, the under cowl, and the spoiler. Most bikes have all three, but only really the under cowl is required. Aero can be made by yourself, but it starts to make less sense when you actually break it down. For lack of a better term, homemade Aero kinda looks like shit, and can often be more of a headache than it's worth. Aero can sometimes be purchased stateside, but you may have to do some digging around. Although there are a ton of chamber options for most of the bikes available in America, they typically wrap back around, which isn't exactly ideal for the style. Most people go for chameleon pipes, which can be bought brand new off WeBike and other similar brands. or look for older chambers on Yahoo. I almost forgot about the most important part: lowering. Thankfully, it's free. Well, mostly free. All that's really required is removing the original spring from the forks and rear shock and replacing them with a skateboard bushing. Although it's not totally necessary, simply running nothing in place of the spring will usually cause some carnage. Finally, the livery. This part is totally up to you. Some opt for the factory paint scheme, as is the case with a lot of Hondas. They really kill the OEM design, where some go into the realm of doing whatever you want. This can basically consist of anything from a drink logo to an R32 Calsonic replica, whatever comes to mind. Beyond this, I would recommend finding inspiration for more stylized pieces from the community. Like the livery, this can be totally up to you, whether you would prefer to keep the bike relatively clean or delve into the realm of creativity. One thing I totally neglected was the helmet. The usual one that you see people running can be bought from Japanese Amazon and shipped internationally. Although it doesn't seem like the safest option, the Bitwell Gringo is a great option for those who want to keep their head relatively stylish without turning into a meat crayon on impact. I'll give a quick breakdown of the bikes I would recommend and the quick pros and cons. The Aero 50. Although the first generation is an option, most people go for the AF09, having by far the most aero options out of any scooter. Although it will require basically everything to convert over to a tack spec, it's probably the most expensive, but also the coolest bike in my opinion. The Jog has 3 generations, requiring a headset and taillight to be converted to the Japanese spec. The 27V and 2JA are both great options for the 80s styling with decent selection of aero and parts. The only difference being that some people opt for the 8-inch wheels on the 27V off of the Yamaha Mint, where the 3KJ slots better into the 90s style alongside the Dio. It's a lot less common than the first generations and is a great pick if you want to stand out a bit. The Dio is basically not an option if you live in the United States, as they basically weren't sold there. The Canadian market, however, received quite a few. They honestly don't require a ton to be converted. People like Mason Capital have demonstrated that simply aero can make these bikes super visually appealing. Then there's the Elite R/DJ1. These bikes, like the Jog, just basically require a headset and rear tail to be converted, and are a super solid pick since they are also pretty uncommon. Finally, the Raz. The Raz is probably the most common bike on this list that you could find locally, but not a ton of people run them. Although they can be great for the style, they do require quite a bit of modification and are limited for aero options. There was aero produced by G-Style, but it's pretty difficult to find, leading some people to go down the route of modifying cowls from other bikes. The biggest con for the Raz really just comes down to the drivetrain. They don't come with a CVT factory, making them pretty poor for keeping up with groups without a swap from a different vertical mini rally motor. Beyond the selection of bikes, you really start to delve into the world of rare and often pricey plastics with bikes like the Spree, or importing bikes that were never received here, if you're looking for something like a DO1 for example. I've seen some people look at the strict list of bikes as a form of gatekeeping, as some of the more desirable models can be kind of hard to find. Although I do think some want to keep the style true to self and not be muddied by people half-assing together stupid builds. Most are just trying to protect you from the headache that would be trying to make something essentially out of nothing. So, that was a quick intro to the Kyu-Gentsuki style. This video could have easily been twice as long, as the subject matter goes much deeper than on first glance. Being an outsider of the scene, I might not be the most knowledgeable person to cover this, but I noticed most of the information on these was spread around and there wasn't really a singular video trying to bridge the knowledge gap. I really wanted to just put something out there, as I'm a huge fan of these bikes and would really love to see the community expand. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, I would potentially look into some of the links I'll have in the description below, namely the American Kyu-Gentsuki book once it becomes available again, and the Facebook group. Beyond that, you would mostly be looking into the weird, small, self-run Japanese forums that can kind of be a bitch to find, or buying some of the previously mentioned magazines. Although they can be pretty pricey, you can just do what I do and just sift through Yahoo Auction Japan listings and try to find a peek at a few pages. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and this finds a new audience who can appreciate these weird little bikes like I do. Thanks for watching.